Tell us about how you were trained to think about risk and how that thinking has evolved as you took on professional responsibilities for huge societal and now huge operational risks.
So my training initially as an academic in war studies was really to look at all the bad things that could happen through a historical context and to understand them deeply in the situation that they evolved in. And so I was not an empirical political scientist. I was much more of a historically based one. And that attempted to understand the strategic dynamic between contesting entities, mostly states that were sort of had different interests and had to resolve their interests through forms of conflict. Later in life, in the new roles, I've learned that that's a useful basis, but incomplete. And particularly in financial institutions, you need a pretty systematic way to keep track of your risk, to track them, to have a common risk registry, and that they go across a lot of different domains. And each domain requires a lot of nuance to understand well.
What is a risk registry?
Well, a risk registry is common for companies. It's essential listing, often organized by how likely something is to occur and how bad it would be if it occurs, that goes across several domains. And each, sophisticated companies know what their risks are. They wouldn't be surviving if they weren't able to manage risk well. And increasingly, and this is fairly commonplace, you track them centrally. And many boards of directors will deem it as a board responsibility, and we'll have a risk committee whose job it is to know the overall risk picture that a company faces. It is different, Eric, sorry to interrupt, for a nation.
That's all right.
Like doing it for a company is frankly a bit simpler than doing it for a country. And a country that is globally entangled like the United States. And so when you're at the White House, you don't have the luxury of a grid, a matrix, and a tidy taxonomy. You have just an infinite number of things coming at you on a regular basis, every single day.
Since you brought it up, and I think because we're all a little curious, what was that like? And what is it like right now? There is a situation room in the White House right now. Tell us what that experience was like for you and what you imagine and maybe have some insight into what's going on right now.
Well, I was a relatively young person when I was there. I was fortunate to be in the very first day of the Bush administration, but then was there at 9/11. And 9/11 was one of these great geopolitical shocks. I frankly thought it would be the big geopolitical shock of my lifetime. Turned out not to be so much. And so it was a rapid learning experience. And frankly, that event temporarily overwhelmed the ability of the sort of policy process, the decision-making process, to keep track of everything. And it was a period of, for me, absolute unprecedented intensity. And we're now back 20 years. It's really not the focus of this talk. But out of that intensity, the Bush administration did develop a sort of strategic clarity of what it was trying to do. And historians and others will debate the rightness of that strategic purpose. But it was clear. And the president had a narrative, and the entire administration sort of got behind it and pursued it in a coherent way, ultimately. Today, you ask about that. So I'm obviously not there. I know many of the people that are managing, in this case, the Ukraine crisis. They are richly informed by history, and they're not rookies. They have gone through a lot of different crises. They have a lot of experience on this, and they are handling this particular crisis, I think, in a somewhat innovative way, but also in a way that is informed by the larger strategic risks that come into play whenever there is a pure conflict, and a conflict with a nuclear-armed state, which is what we essentially have now.
We're going to come back to the innovative way in which they're managing the situation and also the subject of nuclear weapons in a minute. But before we go there, people in finance, and I'm assuming that most of you here are in finance, are interested in finance, have a tendency to think that all risks can be measured and analyzed quantitatively. In fact, there's an enormous industry, loosely called quant, that dedicates itself to that practice. And the approach works reasonably well for variables that follow patterns, right? Interest rates, perhaps, volatility, or the weather. You specialize in a very different category of risk, the kinds of risks we've all confronted in spades over the past several years, and of course, which we may face again: geopolitics, nukes, as we just mentioned, for the first time since I was a teenager, pandemics, and of course, cyber risks. Do you think of those, Richard, the way that quants might think about them as black swans or fat tails?
Probably not. There's a big discipline, and there's lots of really sophisticated, smart people in there. So I don't want to generalize across an entire industry. But I think it is fair to say that certain category of risks, tail risks, things that are extremely rare, don't happen very often, where you have a very small number of events to work with, or things which are strategic in character, where you are dealing with a thinking adversary who is not entirely predictable and is in fact trying to game you just as you were trying to game them. To me, those two things, like low-end events and strategic events, really defy easy quantification, and quantification carries with it risks of making mistakes.
Dead wrong.
And being dead wrong. And so in the case of Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, that was not a statistical probability. That was a decision, and that a human being made, thinking about the totality of his circumstances. And anyone, I think, who could quantify that and say there's a 30% chance or whatever, I think is kidding themselves. I think you've got to recognize what you're dealing with here, which is a strategic phenomenon that changes based on conditions and based on the decision-making framework of whoever's making the calls.
How do you know where to draw the line? How do you know what to identify as a class of risk that can be quantitated, can be measured and can be analyzed quantitatively, and these things that you're describing, where just the sheer individuality of the actor who's responsible for whatever is going to happen is not quantifiable?
Depends where you sit. And so if you're a company and you're running a company, you know what is most important to you, and you draw the line there, if it is about the things that are most important to you. Other risks tend to be the subject of academic specialization. And so where to draw the line on the pandemic risk? The pandemic risk was essentially a risk that a virus would mutate in a particular environmental context leading to a pandemic. That risk was well understood by experts who engaged on it. Wasn't necessarily something on the front page of the general public's mind until it became a world-changing event at the beginning of 2020. So I think there's really no right answer, and it really sort of depends where you sit, where you draw the line.
I'd like you to give us some guidance on Ukraine. How should we be thinking about the trajectory of that conflict? Vladimir Putin's intentions, or perhaps even his endgame, the domino effect of sanctions, European resolve, the possibility that the theater of war expands to include NATO members. How should we be thinking about that in terms of a conceptual framework?
Look, there are experts who will try to study the conflict really closely and understand the dynamic and the interplay of forces and all that. For the specialists, I think that's important to do. I'm not one of them, and I wouldn't pretend to do that. What I think is a more profitable thing to do is to understand the second and third order effects, what you called the domino effects. So trying to predict the outcomes on the battlefield and the negotiations, really, really hard to do. In government, it's important, but for most of us, we're not capable of doing much more than following the news, and we should be humble about our own analytic and predictive capabilities. Where I think you can get a little more traction is by playing through the downstream consequences of that through many different sectors. And so the primary result was a war in Ukraine. It is having multiple repercussions all over the world. It will affect food prices in the developing world as a result of a downstream consequence. And if you can, in a reasonable way, and recognizing your likelihood of being wrong on many things, trace through those consequences into the different sectors that you care about, that I think is a more profitable exercise than trying to be the world's best outside expert on something that you probably really don't understand that well.
If people want to understand better what you're talking about, the implications of that particular event, the invasion of Ukraine, but the geopolitical shifts that may follow or that perhaps lie behind it, what should they be reading?
A lot.
Who should they be watching or listening to?
I'm less confident on that one, on who they should be watching to, because a lot of information is who you choose to listen to, in fact, what you think and how you think about. But what should they be reading? My number one answer is breadth. I mean, to understand the interplay of these big global events is interdisciplinary and is a long process. And so Ray Dalio has a book out. He's talking about changing world order. He speaks about that. He's, I think, right in the sense in order to understand these particular events, you need to be strongly rooted in history. And to see that many of these things have antecedents. They may be far back, but they are there. In the case of pandemic, we had some near misses, but the last one was 102 years ago before the current one. In the case of nuclear weapons, which I think we'll talk about, I think you can usefully go to the 50s and the strategic debates about tactical nuclear weapons that happened then to try to get a sense of what's happening today. So it's a tall order, and it's not something that lends itself to just go here, check this website, follow this blog or this Twitter feed. It's more like you've got to devote a lifetime to trying to understand the global order.
Going back to what you learned in the White House, what you lived through in 9/11, and what you observed and studied when you were earning your PhD, how would you describe what we're living through right now? Because people have put labels on it, right? Is it just a realignment of interests? Is it Cold War II, or is it the beginnings of World War III?
I would say we're in a phase where history is moving very quickly. And a large number of things which historically would play out over decades or centuries are happening in rapid succession. Both geopolitical events like the war, biological events like the pandemic, all the economic consequences of that come, but also multiple simultaneous scientific and technical revolutions, both on the computational science and on the biosciences, genetic medicine. I thought first I thought the end of the Cold War was going to be the major geopolitical event of my life. That's wrong. On 9/11, I thought it was going to be terrorism, and devoted a decade to working on terrorism. Then the financial crisis happened, then the pandemic happened, and now I think what we're seeing is a kind of accordion-like effect of multiple different major global events happening in relatively quickly. And so that would be the frame. I wouldn't give it a simple label of war or conflict, but I just recognize there are a large number of really seismic events happening simultaneously. And keep track of that is hard to do. And then to be very humble about your ability to predict it and understand it and label, I think is also essential.
And then just try to make investment decisions.
Not my job.
You frame it very well. You brought up the potential for nuclear escalation. Tell us a bit about that.
I'm certainly not saying it's particularly likely, but it's something we have to remember. And I'd say by and large, the general public probably forgot about nuclear weapons with the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, if you were alive then, they were talked about a lot. It was a big deal. But with the end of the Cold War, they sort of went into
hibernation.
Yeah, you didn't hear about them very much. And we heard about it with Saddam, but it turned out he didn't have, he wasn't that far along. We hear about it with Iran, but that's an incipient program. We hear about North Korea, that's an early stage program, worrying, but early stage. But the idea that a mature state with a mature nuclear arsenal, which includes Russia and includes us, would be involved in a really intense conflict is a relatively recent, a new thing. Like we haven't lived with that in 20, 30 years. And so once they're in the conversation, you have to take them immensely seriously. They are a taboo. They've not been used since 1945. In general, we have a taboo against the use of weapons of mass destruction. And if they were to be used, and again, I'm not saying this is likely, but if they were to be used either accidentally or deliberately, it would be another huge threshold for the world order. You just cannot ignore that possibility. Without being alarmist about it, you need to understand it. This is one thing I would say about the current administration. We, in New York or wherever we may be, don't think about these things very often. When you're in government and you're dealing with these things, you do think about it all the time. Not necessarily every day, like actively, but you know they're there. You were briefed on them. It is a discipline. There are specialties related to this. And that knowledge exercises a deterrent effect on everyone. So far, for 70 years, has worked to prevent the use of these terrible weapons. But everyone is worried, and a lot of people are worried, that may be breached at some point. And as long as we have these, and we have thousands of them in all different varieties, we, the Russians, the Chinese, it's something that just must slow you down and must, you think carefully, not panicked, but to think about it carefully.
Richard, you were in the White House during the SARS outbreak, and you wrote about pandemic risk as a professor. Tell us what was going through, I should say, in your head in the early days of COVID, when all we knew about it was that some pneumonia-like virus had sprung up in Wuhan.
It was an extraordinary phase, and it will be written about by historians for a long time. My own experience was I was aware of what was happening in China, but it was very poorly understood. But then relatively quickly, in part because of the ability to genomically sequence the virus and the quick flow of information around in the biomedical community, by somewhere between January and February, 2002, a synthesis began to emerge among infectious disease specialists that this virus inherently had a reproductive ability, an inherent transmissibility that was sufficient to make it not containable. Now, the consequences of that were not understood. We had no idea like what the lethality of it had been. But I'd say there was a tipping point. I tie it to sort of early February 2022 when I saw that view. 2020, apologies. I saw that view take hold among the infectious disease specialists that I most respected and that I knew from 20 years ago.
And you took that seriously?
I personally took it very seriously. I wasn't alone, but it was, I knew from my study of history, and many others did, that such a thing had the potential to be a truly global shock, not just in the health event, but then the knock-on effects on global economies, shipping, international relations, societies, and the like.
I can validate that personally. The last time I saw Richard was at a sushi lunch at the very tail end of January or the beginning of February in 2020. And of course, knowing his background, I couldn't help but ask him what he thought about this viral outbreak in Wuhan. And it was beginning to spread. And he made it very clear to me at the time that this is something that he was very, very concerned about and thought that I should be and everybody else should be very concerned about. And the reality, of course, is that you're not the only person who took it seriously at Bridgewater. You and Greg Jensen had a webinar, didn't you, on it? And some people thought you were kind of had lost the plot a little bit, didn't they?
I guess. I mean, we were sort of, maybe we were early. I don't know. I wasn't tracking it, but I forgot about that lunch when we talked about it. And it was a terrifying set of realizations. Like, it was very vivid. You guys probably remember that. Like, when was the moment when it turned and you knew this was something different? And I can pinpoint when it turned for me. It's different for other people. And then it developed in ways that like no one could predict, even though there were historical antecedents for it.
What did Bridgewater do well as an organization that helped it come to that realization quickly?
Well, it's for others to assess how well we did. I was in the middle of it. I mean, Bridgewater dedicates itself to trying to understand the world deeply and systematically, and that's sort of the objective. And our CIOs and others will explain their investment philosophy. But the essence of it is really deep fundamental understanding to the best you can achieve of major global developments, always caveated by humility and trying to be really aware of what we don't know. I mean, you probably heard me say in another of these contexts, my first principle of responding to a crisis is first reports are almost always wrong. And so when you have something happening, be it a terrorist attack or suspected terrorist attack, someone comes in and tells you X, like, do not overreact. Like, slow down, think hard about what it could be and study. And so that, even the way you say the question implies an overconfidence, I really would like to humble that and not suggest this sort of extreme confidence.
With that humility in mind, the pandemic is far from over, unfortunately. But if we look back on the past, now it's 2.25 years, thinking along the lines of what we're trying to do here, which is understand how to manage, conceive of and analyze risk, what lessons seem obvious to you
from the
pandemic experience?
Well, I mean, learn from history. Understand the interconnected of these things. And then the pandemic one is a wonderful illustration of what I said about the primary and secondary effects. The primary effect is a disease that's running wild through. In many ways, the second and third order effects, which are the bigger deal, like the response of governments, how they what they did and their reactions, and then how that cascades through the systems, the response to the human psychology. And so this is like, know about the primary effect. It's good to know about the disease phenomenon, but in some ways, it's all the responses and the responses to the responses that are the bigger thing, and that are like there's a a lot of activity in a lot of different sectors, including the economy, resulting from that.
While we still have some time, I want to talk about cyber risks. Maybe even a decade ago, cyber risks seemed maybe perhaps a little bit exotic. They weren't that, well, they certainly weren't as ever present, and the attacks weren't so commonplace as they are today. And you could even think of, and I'm sure you do, think of the cyber realm as a theater of war. What do we all need to understand about the nature of cyber risk and the actors involved?
Well, it's a huge topic, but I mean, first let's put it in a historical context. Your premise is correct. 20 years ago on the transition team going into the White House, cybersecurity was not a top topic. And in fact, one of the experts suggested that the government should organize more around it in 2021, and that was rejected. And so it was really an esoteric topic. By the end of the Bush administration, I was out by then, but by 2008, it was emerging as, wow, this is a really big deal. And we went through a phase of being behind the eight ball in almost every level on understanding it, responding to it, preparing for it, how to deal with it, thinking about it. Governments, boards, companies, IT departments were sort of unprepared. It's now shifted significantly. Like any mature organization now has to take this immensely seriously and just understand this is a big deal. And it is a fundamental element of running your business is to understand that and to have very expert, skilled people and resources going against the problem systematically. Fortunately, the industry now has matured a lot. And so while the risk is still ever present and dynamic and complex, not easily predicted, there are systems, there are mature technologies and methodologies and things that exist that 10 years ago were not there.
To our knowledge, the United States, or for that matter, the Western world, hasn't yet experienced a major destabilizing cyber attack, the kind that, for example, would take down the electricity grid or internet service providers. As I say, to our knowledge. Is that surprising?
It's noteworthy, and to watch it. I try to avoid predicting these things, so that means I try to avoid being surprised when they do or do not happen. I think the important thing is to be aware of a range of possibilities and to be open that it could come up at any different way. So the thing that you described is, of course, a possibility. There are preparations underway for that. I'm not sure that they're adequate, and that could happen. Why, if that's happening behind the scenes, we don't know, possibly. If that's being deterred, if the capability was degraded in some way, who knows? We don't know. All the way through more pedestrian applications where it doesn't happen at all. So sorry for sort of avoiding the question, but I'm trying to be honest of what I do and don't know.
One of the more interesting aspects to the unfolding situation in Ukraine is the choices that the Biden administration and some of its allies, and I would cite the UK, has made in deciding to use information as a weapon. And in some respects, it's almost turning, I think of it as almost turning Putin-esque tactics back on himself. Talk to us about that, because it is so fascinating, and I know you've thought about it.
So think of the information space, the narrative about major events, as a domain of warfare. I mean, like air, land, sea, underwater, space, cyber, information is also a domain. And I actually agree with your premise that in some ways is one of the most interesting things to watch. Because while propaganda and censorship have been efforts long-standing to control the information plane in warfare, I actually think this conflict is showing significant innovation, particularly with the release of intelligence, sensitive, previously super secret compartmented intelligence that the US government and others have about what Russia could do, what they're thinking about, what they're capable of, in advance of it actually happening. And unlike, say, the Iraq War, where there was an unsuccessful attempt to shape that with what turned out to be somewhat incorrect information about Iraqi WMD, in this case, it looks like they're mostly accurate forecasts. And I think in some ways, this conflict is almost writing a new playbook, a new page in the book of statecraft, of how you can proactively shape the information environment through the selective release of things that you learn through secret means. And I don't have inside information on that. I'm watching that from the outside, the Gulf view, but I urge you to watch it closely because I think it's fascinating. And frankly, Erik, events like this are part of that information plane. Like this, going on the terminal and going on television and on radio, that is an element of interstate conflict, and this is just another place where it's playing out.
Well, Richard, I knew this conversation about risks you can't afford to ignore would be terrific. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you weren't disappointed. Please join me in thanking Richard Falkenrath.